This land may seem like just another ancient civilization, a name in dusty scrolls, a few ruins in the dirt, but it's not what you think. While the great empires of Mesopotamia, Rome, and Egypt fell into ruin, China endured. For over 5,000 years, it has withstood everything history could throw at it: devastating floods, brutal wars, internal collapse, and foreign conquest. Dynasties have risen and burned, emperors have ruled and vanished, yet the thread of Chinese civilization never broke. Through fire and famine, from bronze tools to atomic clocks, China remained. It is the longest continuous civilization in history, not by chance, but by sheer resilience, reinvention, and will. And its story is nothing short of extraordinary. If China had collapsed in its infancy, swallowed by its rivers, broken by rebellion, or erased by foreign conquest, the world would be unrecognizable today. We would have lost more than a civilization. We would have lost the birthplace of paper, the printing press, the magnetic compass, and gunpowder, inventions that reshaped the fate of empires across continents. The Silk Road, which once carried silk and philosophy across deserts and seas, might never have existed. A world without Confucian ethics, Taoist philosophy, or the meticulous bureaucratic systems that influenced modern governance would be a world missing pillars of thought and order. Today, 1.4 billion lives are shaped by 5,000 years of continuous cultural memory. China's survival didn't just preserve a nation, it preserved a foundation of the modern world. Before China became an empire, before emperors ruled from gilded thrones, and long before it was called China at all, there was the river, the Yellow River, Huanghe, a force of nature that gave life and brought death in equal measure. It flooded unpredictably, violently, and often without mercy. Entire settlements disappeared under waves of yellow silt. Yet the people who lived along its banks never fled. They endured. They learned to bend, not break. And from this struggle, between humanity and nature, a civilization was born. Not a small kingdom or a scattered tribe, but a society that would eventually become the longest-lasting continuous civilization on Earth. In the earliest times, this society left few written records, but its stories survived, carried in oral tradition, then inked into bamboo strips and bronze vessels centuries later. These stories are not easily separated from myth, nor should they be. In the oldest tales, the world was not ruled by kings, but by sages. Culture heroes who tamed nature, established virtue, and laid the foundation of what it meant to be civilized. One of the most enduring of these legends is the story of the Great Flood, a deluge so vast, so unrelenting, that it threatened to erase early humanity from the face of the earth. This flood, according to Chinese legend, was not a one-time disaster. It lasted for generations. Crops drowned, villages washed away. The very mountains seemed to melt into the sea. In this chaos, a man named Gun was appointed to stop the catastrophe. He failed. Gun's method was defiance. He tried to block the floodwaters with high embankments, trying to contain the uncontrollable. But the Yellow River was no ordinary river. It shattered Gun's dikes and left ruin in its wake. For his failure, Gun was either executed by the emperor or died alone. Accounts vary, but his legacy did not end with him. His son, Yu, would succeed where his father had failed, not through brute force, but through understanding. Yu studied the river. He did not try to cage it. Instead, he sought to guide it. Over years of observation, experimentation, and relentless labor, Yu led massive earthworks to dig canals, dredge channels, and divert water toward the sea. He mobilized thousands of workers. According to legend, he worked for over a decade without once returning home, even passing his house multiple times and refusing to enter. Yu's plan was not domination of nature, but harmony with it, and for this reason it succeeded. The floodwaters receded, Land became fertile, crops returned, the people thrived. In recognition of his achievement, Yu was chosen as ruler. Not because of his birth, but because of his merit. This was revolutionary. Until then, leadership had been largely tribal or inherited. With Yu, a new ideal emerged: virtuous rule, earned by action. Yu the Great became the first emperor of what would be remembered as the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in Chinese tradition, founded around 2070 BCE. Yet there is a catch. For generations, the Xia remained elusive. Ancient historians like Sima Qian described their rulers, their lineages, their fall, but no material evidence confirmed their existence. Archaeologists debated, was the Xia real, or a retroactive myth created by later dynasties to legitimize their own rule? The debate persisted for centuries. Then, in the mid-20th century, something changed. Excavations at a site called Erlitou in modern-day Henan province revealed a vast urban Bronze Age settlement. Streets aligned on a grid. Palatial buildings stood on rammed earth foundations. Bronze workshops produced ceremonial vessels and tools. Jade ornaments, burial tombs, and painted ceramics suggested complex social stratification. The site dated to the time period traditionally assigned to the Xia. Though there is still no definitive inscription naming Erlitou as the Xia capital, many scholars now consider it the best candidate. Whether it was truly Xia in name, it marked the emergence of China's first state-level society. What we know of this period combines archaeology and inherited memory. According to legend, the Xia thrived for centuries, with a succession of rulers continuing Yu's legacy. But the dynasty ended not with wisdom, but with decadence. Its final ruler, Ji of Xia, was said to be cruel and tyrannical, building lavish palaces, indulging in debauchery, and punishing dissent with torture. He became the archetype of the failed king, the warning to future rulers. And as the people suffered under his rule, a new power began to rise. That power came from the east, the Shang. And unlike the Xia, the Shang left no doubt about their existence. Their legacy is carved into bone and cast in bronze. The Shang dynasty, which ruled roughly from 1600 to 1046 BCE, marks the beginning of China's recorded history. It was the Shang who moved China from the fog of legend into the light of archaeological certainty. Their capital cities, especially the last and most famous, Yin, near modern-day Anyang, were sprawling complexes. Massive palaces, religious altars, burial tombs, bronze foundries, and military training grounds formed the backbone of their cities. This was not a simple tribal culture. This was an advanced, centralized state. The Shang mastered bronze technology unlike any of their contemporaries. They produced sophisticated vessels for rituals, weapons for war, and chariot fittings for nobility. Bronze wasn't just a utility, it was power. Ownership of bronze reflected hierarchy, and bronze casting was tightly controlled by the elite. Large-scale production required labor, skill, and organization, and it confirmed the Shang's dominance over both people and material. But their most profound contribution to history wasn't cast in metal. It was written on bone. In the late 19th century, Chinese farmers near Anyang began discovering what they called dragon bones, fragments of ox scapulae and turtle shells inscribed with strange symbols. These bones were ground into powder and used in traditional medicine. It wasn't until 1899 that a scholar named Wang Yirong, recovering from illness, realized the medicine he had been prescribed was covered in ancient script. These were not dragon bones. They were oracle bones, the earliest known examples of Chinese writing. The Shang elite used these bones for divination. Questions were carved into the surface. Will it rain tomorrow? Will the harvest be good? Will we win the battle? and then the bones were heated until they cracked. The cracks were interpreted by diviners, believed to be signs from the ancestors or the heavens. These questions, answers, and sometimes results were then inscribed onto the bones, creating a priceless historical record. Over 150,000 oracle bones have since been unearthed. Together, they form a detailed, direct window into Shang political, military, and religious life. We learn not only about the concerns of kings, but about their battles, their rituals, their fears, and their worldview. And astonishingly, the writing system on these bones is directly ancestral to modern Chinese characters. The language has evolved, but its core structure, logograms representing ideas and objects, remains intact. This makes Chinese the oldest continuous writing system still in use today. The oracle bones also tell us about the Shang belief system. Central to it was ancestor worship. The Shang saw their deceased forebears not as passive spirits, but as active participants in the world of the living. Kings served as high priests, communicating with ancestors through rituals and sacrifices. These spirits, in turn, could influence weather, fertility, warfare, and governance. Above all stood Shangdi, the supreme deity, remote and powerful, not unlike the heaven that would later become central to the mandate of heaven. The Shang kings were not mere figureheads. They were warrior priests. Their rule rested on three pillars: military strength, ritual authority, and divinatory power. Their armies used chariots, a technology likely adapted through contact with Central Asian nomads, and employed bronze weaponry with brutal efficiency. Their rituals demanded animal, and sometimes human, sacrifice. Royal tombs reveal skeletal remains of servants and captives, buried alive or beheaded to accompany their masters in death. To modern eyes, it's shocking, but to the Shang, it was order, a cosmic balance between life, death, and power. Despite this might, the Shang eventually declined. Whether through internal corruption, natural disasters, or loss of public confidence, their hold weakened. The last Shang king, Di Xin, was accused of extreme cruelty and moral collapse, entertaining himself with lakes of wine and forests of meat, and ignoring his people's suffering. Whether these accounts are exaggerations or moral fables is unclear, but what followed is not. In the 11th century BCE, a rising western state, the Zhou, overthrew the Shang at the Battle of Muye, and with this, the Shang dynasty fell. But its legacy did not. The Shang gave China its first written language, a model of ritual governance, and a centralized state that influenced every dynasty that followed. They showed that Chinese civilization was not just ancient, it was sophisticated, dynamic, and uniquely resilient. The Shang were not just the end of the mythic past. They were the beginning of Chinese history, from flood-swept plains and the legend of a man who moved mountains to kings who questioned the spirits through cracked bone. Early China laid the foundation for a civilization that would endure everything time could throw at it. The Yellow River may have given life, but it also demanded greatness, and it got it. From you the Great, from the kings of Shang, and from the ancestors whose names still echo through 5,000 years of unbroken memory. When the Shang fell, the Zhou rose, not just as a dynasty, but as an idea. In many ways, the Zhou weren't simply successors to the Shang. They were reformers, visionaries, and the architects of a new moral and political order that would shape Chinese thought for millennia. With the fall of the Shang around 1046 BCE, at the Battle of Muye, the Zhou seized power and declared that heaven, Tian, had withdrawn its blessing from the Shang kings and given it to them. This was the birth of the Mandate of Heaven, a revolutionary concept in political legitimacy that would be used to justify every regime change in Chinese history for the next 3,000 years. The Zhou dynasty would last longer than any other dynasty in Chinese history, nearly 800 years, from 1046 to 256 BCE. But its longevity was not without complications. The dynasty is traditionally divided into two major periods: the Western Zhou, which maintained central authority and ruled from a strong unified capital, and the Eastern Zhou, which descended into fragmentation and civil war. It was during the Eastern Zhou period that China plunged into chaos and paradoxically gave birth to its most profound philosophical traditions. In the early days of the Western Zhou, the kings ruled with a powerful combination of religious authority and feudal structure. Like the Shang before them, they practiced ancestral worship and performed elaborate rituals to connect with the spirits of their predecessors. But the Zhou expanded their ideological reach. The mandate of heaven wasn't just a reason to overthrow a tyrant, it was a moral doctrine. Rulers had a divine responsibility to govern justly, protect the people, and maintain cosmic order. If they failed, natural disasters, famine, or rebellion would signal that the mandate had been revoked. This idea, subtle and potent, created both stability and pressure. It kept kings accountable, at least in theory, and offered the people a justification for rebellion when rulers lost their virtue. No longer were kings simply the sons of gods or chosen by fate. They were servants of heaven, conditional in their right to rule. This moral political philosophy became a cornerstone of Chinese governance. However, this unity did not last. As the Zhou kings granted fiefs to relatives and allies, local warlords gained power. Over generations, their loyalty to the central throne faded. By the time of the Eastern Zhou period, which began in 770 BCE after the royal court was forced eastward to Luoyang, the king's authority was mostly ceremonial. China fractured into dozens of competing states, each led by ambitious lords, all claiming legitimacy, all vying for dominance. What followed was a period of extraordinary violence and intellectual awakening. The Spring and Autumn period, 770–476 BCE, saw over 100 wars between rival states. Armies clashed, alliances shifted, and rulers fell. Yet it was also an era where scholars, thinkers, and statesmen wrestled with one overwhelming question: how do you restore order in a world consumed by chaos? This question birthed what historians call the 100 schools of thought, a dazzling explosion of philosophy, ethics, and political theory unmatched in any other period of Chinese history. Out of this intellectual crucible emerged giants, whose teachings still shape global consciousness today. The most influential was Confucius, known in Chinese as Kongfuzi, or Master Kong. Born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, Confucius was a scholar, teacher, and former government official. He lived in a time of violence and corruption and believed that the path back to stability lay not through military conquest, but through moral cultivation. His philosophy was built on one word: Ren, often translated as humanness or benevolence. A just society, Confucius argued, begins with the individual. If rulers are virtuous, their subjects will follow. If fathers are righteous, sons will be loyal. If people respect ritual and tradition, harmony will return. Confucianism was not a religion. It had no gods, no afterlife doctrine, no salvation. It was a system of ethics grounded in hierarchy, filial piety, ritual propriety, and duty. It was deeply conservative, aiming to restore a golden age by reviving the values of the early Zhou. Yet in its simplicity, it carried profound social weight. Education became a path to leadership. Government was seen not as a tool of force, but a test of character, and the family, not the individual, was the core unit of civilization. Confucius died in obscurity, but over the next few centuries, his disciples compiled his sayings into the Analects, and Confucianism gradually became the dominant ideology of the imperial bureaucracy. Future emperors would rule with Confucianism, or be judged by it. But Confucianism wasn't the only school to rise in this age of turmoil. It had rivals, fierce ones. To some thinkers, Confucian virtue was naive. People were not naturally good. They were selfish, greedy, and violent. What kept society from tearing itself apart was not morality, but law. From this view emerged legalism, championed most famously by Han Feizi. Legalists argued for strict rules, harsh punishments, and a powerful state. They saw government not as a moral teacher, but as a machine of control. For legalists, the end goal was not harmony, it was obedience and stability. They favored military discipline, centralized authority, and the eradication of dissent. Legalism would eventually become the backbone of the first unified Chinese empire under the Qin dynasty. In sharp contrast to both Confucianism and legalism stood Taoism, a philosophy rooted not in statecraft or social ethics, but in the natural world. Associated with the legendary figure Laozi, author of the Tao Te Ching, Taoism taught that all things flow from the Tao, the way, an invisible eternal force that underlies the universe. The Tao cannot be grasped by reason or controlled. By policy, it must be felt, followed, allowed to flow. He who conquers others is strong, wrote Laozi. He who conquers himself is mighty. Taoism encouraged non-action, wu-wei, simplicity, humility, and balance. Its influence would be felt not only in religion and metaphysics, but in medicine, martial arts, painting, and poetry. Where Confucians revered ritual, Taoists revered spontaneity. Where legalists built empires, Taoists wandered the mountains. Together, these three schools, Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism, formed the philosophical triangle that would define Chinese thought for over 2,000 years. But ideas alone couldn't stop the bloodshed. As the Eastern Zhou period, it gave way to the Warring States period, 475–221 BCE. Violence escalated. Massive armies clashed across plains and mountains. Technological advances in iron weapons, crossbows, and siege tactics turned warfare into a science. States grew more centralized, more bureaucratic, and more ruthless. Small kingdoms were swallowed by larger ones. And in the shadows, a new force was rising, one that would soon unify all under heaven. Yet even as war consumed the land, the seeds of China's future had already been planted. The Zhou had fractured, but their legacy endured, not in territory, but in thought. The mandate of heaven, the moral responsibilities of rulers, the role of the individual within the collective, the power of law, the wisdom of nature, these ideas, debated and refined during the Zhou era, became the bedrock of Chinese civilization. The Zhou dynasty did not end with a dramatic fall, but with a quiet erosion. In 256 BCE, the last Zhou king died, powerless, ignored by the warlords who now carved China into warring pieces. Yet the Zhou were not forgotten. Their age became a touchstone, a reference point for what a just and ordered world should look like. Every dynasty that followed would claim in some way to revive the spirit of Zhou. In many civilizations, collapse brings silence. In China, collapse brought clarity. The Zhou dynasty showed that power is not just measured in soldiers or gold, but in ideas. That the battle for a nation's soul can be fought not only on battlefields, but in classrooms, courtrooms, and quiet conversations. The Zhou didn't just rule China, they taught it how to think. By the 3rd century BCE, China was bleeding. For over 2 centuries, the land had been carved into pieces, warring kingdoms, fighting endlessly for control, power, and legitimacy. This was the Warring States period, a time of iron swords, political scheming, massive armies, and unrelenting conflict. 7 dominant states, Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin, vied to dominate the others. But among them, it was Qin, a western frontier state once dismissed as barbaric and uncivilized that would bring the chaos to an end. And it would do so not with mercy, but with ruthless efficiency. The man who would unify China was born in 259 BCE. His name was Ying Zheng, though history would remember him by a far more absolute title, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. His rise was not inevitable, but it was unstoppable. The Qin state had long prepared for dominance. While other kingdoms clung to old aristocratic traditions, Qin embraced reform. Under the guidance of legalist thinkers like Shang Yang, Qin had created a centralized, militarized, and merit-based bureaucracy. Nobility was no longer inherited. It was earned in battle, land was redistributed, taxation was standardized, the state rewarded loyalty and punished disobedience. The result was a government lean in philosophy but brutal in practice. Qin's military was the most disciplined in China. It deployed massive infantry formations, cavalry, and iron-clad chariots. Engineers built roads for fast movement, while spies infiltrated rival courts. By the time Ying Zheng ascended the throne, the Qin war machine was already poised to conquer. One by one, the rival states fell. In 230 BCE, Qin annexed Han, then Zhao, Yan, and Wei followed in swift succession. Chu, the most powerful and culturally distinct of the warring states, fell in 223 BCE after a brutal campaign. Finally, in 221 BCE, the state of Qi surrendered without a fight. For the first time in history, China was unified under a single ruler. Ying Zheng declared himself not merely king, but Huangdi, august sovereign or emperor. He took the name Qin Shi Huang, meaning first emperor of Qin. It was a title never before used. He was not just a ruler of men, he was the master of all under heaven. And with unification came transformation. Qin Shi Huang set out to erase the divisions of the past and forge a single, indivisible empire. He standardized weights and measures, ensuring that grain, distance, and metal were counted the same in every corner of his realm. He imposed a uniform currency, cast in bronze and shaped like circular coins with square holes, a form that would influence Chinese money for 2,000 years. He unified the writing system, transforming a chaotic patchwork of scripts into a single official style, small seal script. Even axle lengths for carts were standardized so that all vehicles could use the same ruts in the road. Nothing was too small. Nothing was left to chance, but unification also came at a cost. Qin Shi Huang was not a gentle ruler. He did not seek harmony through virtue, as Confucians would later advocate. He ruled through force and control. His legalist advisors encouraged tight surveillance, harsh laws, and absolute obedience. The empire's success depended not on the goodwill of the people, but on their submission. One of the most infamous episodes of Qin rule was the burning of books and burying of scholars in 213 BCE. Determined to eliminate dissent and unify ideology, the emperor ordered the destruction of all non-legalist texts, especially Confucian works that glorified past dynasties or questioned authority. According to historical sources, hundreds of scholars were executed or buried alive for resisting. Though some modern historians debate the exact scale of the purge, its symbolic impact is undeniable. The Qin regime would tolerate no competition, not in thought, not in loyalty. Despite the oppression, Qin Shi Huang was also a visionary. He ordered massive infrastructure projects, the construction of a vast network of roads and canals stretching over 4,000 miles, the creation of a defensive wall system in the north that would eventually evolve into the Great Wall of China, and, most famously, the building of his own mausoleum, a project so grand it still baffles archaeologists today. Discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well near Xi'an, The Terracotta Army is one of the most astounding archaeological finds in human history. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each with unique facial features and armor, stand in silent formation. Accompanied by horses, chariots, archers, and officials, they were buried to guard the emperor in the afterlife. And these soldiers were just the surface. Beneath a nearby hill lies the emperor's tomb, still unopened, rumored to contain rivers of mercury and entire palaces recreated underground. Yet for all his accomplishments, Qin Shi Huang was not immortal. Obsessed with living forever, he consumed elixirs of mercury, believing they would grant him eternal life. Instead, they slowly poisoned him. In 210 BCE, he died while touring his empire, far from the capital and in secrecy. His death was covered up by officials who feared instability. But instability came anyway. The emperor's heir was weak, manipulated by court officials, and utterly unprepared to govern. Rebellions began to flare almost immediately. The Qin dynasty, built in blood and iron, collapsed just 4 years after the death of its founder. By 206 BCE, the Qin Empire, the first unified state in Chinese history, was gone, and yet its legacy lived on. Though short-lived, the Qin dynasty established the template for all future Chinese empires: centralized bureaucracy, legal codification, infrastructure uniting the empire, a national script, standardized coinage, the idea that China could be and should be one nation under one ruler. Later dynasties would look back on Qin with both awe and fear, a lesson in what absolute power could achieve and what it could destroy. The man who had unified China had done the impossible, but in his ambition to control everything, he had sown the seeds of rebellion. The first emperor's tomb still lies sealed, untouched for over 2,000 years. His army stands silently beneath the earth, eyes locked forward, waiting, watching, as if the emperor in death still believed his empire could last forever. With the fall of the Qin in 206 BCE, China stood on the edge of another collapse. The unified empire that had taken decades to forge disintegrated in less than 5 years. Civil war erupted. Former generals, nobles, and peasants alike seized the opportunity to claim power. Among them was a man from the unlikeliest background, a commoner born into poverty who would become the founder of one of China's greatest dynasties. His name was Liu Bang, and he would become the first emperor of the Han dynasty. Liu Bang was not a noble. He was not a warrior by birth. He had no elite family name or legacy to uphold. He had once been a low-ranking patrol officer, a small-time bureaucrat. But in the chaos that followed the Qin collapse, he proved himself a cunning leader and charismatic commander. After defeating his rival Xiang Yu, a brilliant general of noble descent, Liu Bang declared himself emperor in 202 BCE, taking the title Emperor Gaozu of Han. His victory marked the beginning of the Western Han dynasty, and with it, the restoration not only of order, but of a new vision for Chinese civilization. The Han dynasty would rule for over 4 centuries, from 202 BCE to 220 CE, a span so influential that even today, the majority ethnic group in China calls themselves the Han people. It was a dynasty that merged the brutal lessons of the Qin with the humanistic philosophy of Confucius. It kept the centralization of empire, the standardized laws, and the unified bureaucracy. But it softened the harshness of legalism. Where Qin ruled through fear, the Han sought to govern through balance, a synthesis of law, ritual, and moral order. One of the Han's greatest achievements was its administrative structure. The empire was divided into commanderies and counties, each governed by appointed officials. These officials were selected not by birthright alone, but increasingly by merit. The foundations of the civil service system were laid here. The idea that government should be staffed by educated men trained in Confucian texts, tested in their knowledge and loyal to the state. This bureaucratic system, refined over centuries, would become the backbone of imperial China. Confucianism, once persecuted under the Qin, now became the state philosophy. The teachings of Confucius were promoted at all levels of education. Scholars were revered. Moral conduct, filial piety, respect for ritual, and loyalty to the emperor were ingrained into the social fabric. The Han court established Confucian academies, and future emperors would be judged not only by military conquests, but by how well they embodied Confucian ideals. But the Han were not just scholars, they were builders, conquerors, and innovators. Under Emperor Wu of Han, known as Han Wudi, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE, the dynasty reached its zenith. Han Wudi was an ambitious and tireless ruler. He expanded the empire's borders through military campaigns into modern-day Korea, Vietnam, and Central Asia. He fought the powerful Xiongnu Confederation in the north, nomadic warriors who had long threatened China's borders, and pushed them back, securing vital trade routes. These routes would evolve into the legendary Silk Road. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a vast network of trade paths stretching from China across Central Asia to the Middle East and Europe. It was through this artery of commerce that silk, the most prized commodity of ancient China, flowed westward. In return came horses, gold, glassware, spices, and ideas. Buddhism began its long journey into China along these routes. So did technological and agricultural knowledge. The Han weren't just connected to their neighbors. They were now connected to the world. Internally, Han China thrived. The population boomed. Agricultural innovations like iron plows, wheelbarrows, and improved irrigation boosted food production. Cities expanded. Roads and canals tied the empire together. Markets bustled with goods. The Han period saw the invention of paper, credited to Kai Lun around 105 CE. A revolutionary innovation that would eventually reshape global literacy and record-keeping. The Han also elevated historical writing. The scholar Sima Qian compiled the monumental records of the Grand Historian, a sweeping chronicle of China's history from mythical times to his present day. It wasn't just a record of emperors and wars, it was a philosophical reflection on power, fate, and morality. For Sima Qian, history was not just a mirror of the past, but a teacher for the future. But the Han were not invincible. By the 1st century CE, internal strains began to surface. Court factions, eunuchs, and powerful. Noble families competed for influence, tax burdens increased, peasant uprisings flared. In 9 CE, a powerful regent named Wang Mang usurped the throne and declared a new dynasty, the Qin dynasty. His reforms, meant to redistribute land and restore equity, failed disastrously. Natural disasters and rebellion ended his rule within 15 years. The Han were restored in 25 CE, beginning the Eastern Han period. The capital moved east to Luoyang, and for a time stability returned. Trade resumed, culture flourished, but the same problems re-emerged. Corruption seeped into the bureaucracy. The gap between rich and poor widened. In 184 CE, a massive uprising, known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion, led by a Taoist-inspired peasant movement, shook the empire to its core. The central government never fully recovered. Warlords rose in the provinces. The imperial court became a puppet. By 220 CE, the last Han emperor was forced to abdicate. The Han dynasty, once the most powerful empire in East Asia, was no more. And yet, like the dynasties before it, the Han left behind more than ruins. It left a blueprint, not only for governance, but for civilization. The Confucian model of statecraft, the civil service system, the ideal of unity under heaven, these became embedded in China's identity. Foreign invaders and internal rebels would rise and fall, but they would all claim to restore or revive the Han legacy. The Han dynasty became a symbol of cultural pride, political legitimacy, and what China could be at its best. It had taken a commoner to build it, warrior emperor to expand it, and generations of scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants to sustain it. Together, they forged an empire that would be remembered not just for its power, but for its wisdom. The golden age had come and gone, and what followed would be darkness, but never silence. The spirit of Han would endure. When the Han dynasty collapsed in 220 CE, it left behind not just an empty throne, but a fractured world. China, once united under a single emperor, splintered into competing states. The dream of imperial unity shattered. What followed was nearly 4 centuries of division, war, and foreign invasion. This era, often called the Age of Disunity, or the period of the 6 dynasties, tested the endurance of Chinese civilization more than almost any time before. And yet, out of this chaos would rise one of the most brilliant chapters in China's history, the Tang dynasty. But first came collapse. After the fall of the Han, regional warlords seized power. The empire fragmented into 3 kingdoms. Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast. These 3 rival states fought bitterly for control in one of the most legendary and romanticized periods of Chinese history. This was the age of Zhuge Liang, Cao Cao, and Guan Yu, military tacticians and warriors immortalized in the epic romance of the 3 kingdoms. But in reality, it was an age of bloodshed. Millions died, the economy contracted, infrastructure decayed. Eventually, all 3 kingdoms were absorbed or destroyed, but unity didn't return. What followed were centuries of alternating rule by short-lived dynasties in both the north and south of China. Northern China fell under the control of foreign and mixed ethnic rulers, notably the Xianbai, a nomadic people from the steppe. In the south, Han Chinese elites tried to maintain the traditions of the past, often in isolation and cultural conservatism. These centuries saw a tug-of-war between northern military might and southern scholarly pride. And yet, despite the chaos, this period was not empty of progress. It was during these centuries of fragmentation that Buddhism took deep root in China. Introduced via the Silk Road centuries earlier, it had remained a foreign religion during Han times. But in the turmoil of the Age of Division, its message of suffering, karma, and spiritual liberation resonated with a broken society. Monks translated Indian sutras into Chinese, built temples, and spread teachings. Great cave complexes like Mogao in Dunhuang and Yungang in Datong were carved out of mountains filled with towering Buddha statues, intricate murals, and religious texts. Buddhism began to transform Chinese art, literature, and even government. Emperors patronized monks. Temples became centers of economic power and intellectual life, and Buddhism started blending with Taoism and Confucianism, creating a uniquely Chinese synthesis of thought. The cultural seeds planted in this period would blossom in the centuries ahead. Still, the dream of political unification remained distant until the rise of a northern general turned emperor. In 581 CE, Yang Jian, a powerful official of mixed Han and Xianbei descent, seized power and declared the start of the Sui dynasty. Though short-lived, the Sui would succeed where others failed. They reunited China under a single rule. Yang Jian, now Emperor Wen of Sui, restored central authority, rebuilt the bureaucracy, and reasserted Confucian governance. His most ambitious project, however, was the construction of the Grand Canal, a massive engineering feat that linked the fertile Yangtze River basin in the south to the economic heartlands of the north. It became a vital artery of grain, goods, and soldiers, and would remain essential for over 1,000 years. But the Sui burned too fast. Emperor Wen's son, Yang Di, expanded the empire through costly military campaigns into Korea and Central Asia. He raised taxes, conscripted massive labor forces, and ruled with increasing extravagance. Rebellions erupted. In 618 CE, Yangdi was assassinated by his own officials. The Sui collapsed. But from its ashes rose a dynasty even greater, forged by the general who had helped bring it down, Li Yuan, founder of the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty, 680 to 907 CE, was not merely a continuation of empire. It was a renaissance. Under Emperor Taizong, the Tang expanded rapidly, crushing rival warlords, pacifying the borders, and reviving the ideals of Confucian government. Yet the Tang were far more cosmopolitan than their Han predecessors. Their capital, Chang'an, became the largest city in the world, a metropolis of over 1 million people, filled with merchants, scholars, monks, soldiers, poets, and foreigners. Markets brimmed with Persian carpets, Indian spices, Korean ceramics, and Arab perfumes. Tang China was the epicenter of a global network of trade and diplomacy. The Tang court sent ambassadors to Central Asia, received emissaries from the Abbasid Caliphate, and welcomed missionaries and travelers from across Eurasia. In the capital, one could hear dozens of languages, worship in Buddhist, Taoist, Zoroastrian, and Nestorian churches, and read poetry on every wall. This wasn't isolation. This was integration. Tang China was the beating heart of a connected, medieval world. Culturally, the Tang period reached unmatched heights. Poetry, in particular, became both an art form and a political tool. To be a scholar official was to be a poet. Great masters like Li Bai and Du Fu wrote verses that captured the empire's grandeur and despair. Their words are still taught today. Painting, calligraphy, music, and fashion all flourished. Court culture combined elegance with precision. The civil service exam system, refined further during this era, allowed men of talent, at least in theory, to rise through merit, not birth. This Confucian bureaucracy became the model for governance across East Asia. The Tang military was equally formidable. Emperors expanded westward through a series of brilliant campaigns, establishing Chinese influence deep into Central Asia. The empire reached its largest territorial extent under Emperor Xuanzong. Chinese armies garrisoned cities on the far side of the desert. The empire was at its peak, prosperous, powerful, confident, but greatness breeds complacency. In 755 CE, a trusted general named An Lushan, who commanded a large frontier army, turned against the Tang. His rebellion became one of the deadliest civil wars in history. The An Lushan rebellion lasted nearly 8 years, claimed tens of millions of lives, and permanently weakened the Tang court. Though the dynasty survived, on paper for another 150 years, it never recovered its former strength. Regional military governors, jidushi, gained increasing autonomy. The court lost control over tax revenue, armies, and appointments. Factionalism, court intrigue, and eunuch dominance further corroded imperial authority. By the early 9th century, the once mighty Tang Empire was a shadow of itself. In 907 CE, a warlord finally deposed the last Tang emperor. The dynasty was dead. China once again entered a period of disunity, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. But the legacy of the Tang endured. The Tang dynasty proved that China could be more than a Confucian state. It could be cosmopolitan, open, and globally connected. It could embrace foreign religions and trade networks without losing its core identity. It could reward art and intellect as much as it rewarded conquest. And even in its decline, it taught future dynasties how to manage and how not to manage power. From the ruins of the Han to the cosmopolitan streets of Chang'an, China had endured centuries of chaos and transformation, but its foundation held. The Chinese idea of all under heaven, the belief in order, continuity, and civilization never disappeared, even when unity did. And now, after disintegration once more, China was ready to rebuild. The next dynasty would rise not just as a restorer of Tang glory, but as the pioneer of a new economic and intellectual revolution, the Song dynasty. When the Tang dynasty collapsed in 907 CE, China once again fractured. Regional warlords and short-lived dynasties vied for control in a chaotic interlude known as the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. For more than half a century, China was divided, unstable, and directionless. But in 960 CE, a military general named Zhao Kuangyin staged a coup that would transform the landscape. He became Emperor Taizu of Song, founding a dynasty that would not only reunify much of China, but spark one of the most astonishing eras of innovation and intellectual achievement in Chinese history. The Song dynasty, 960–1279 CE, did not rise through brute conquest like the Qin or the Tang. Instead, it built power through administrative sophistication, economic strength, and cultural flourishing. Song rulers focused on internal development, enhancing institutions, refining the civil service, and promoting commerce. It was a quieter kind of power, but no less transformative. Unlike their Tang predecessors, the early Song emperors were deeply suspicious of warlords. They placed military power firmly under civil control, prioritizing loyalty and merit over battlefield glory. The result was a more stable state, less prone to rebellion, but also one that struggled to defend its borders. That tension would haunt the dynasty for centuries. But within those borders, the Song achieved feats of governance, culture, and science that rivaled anything in the world at the time. At the heart of Song governance was the imperial examination system. Though it existed before, the Song dramatically expanded its scope and scale. Instead of relying on aristocratic bloodlines, the Song filled its bureaucracy with scholars who had passed a series of grueling exams, tests not on warfare or economics, but on Confucian philosophy, poetry, history, and ethics. This system became a defining institution of Chinese civilization. It created a new elite, the scholar official, a class of educated men who saw themselves as moral guardians of the state. This system was deeply Confucian, but it also had unintended effects. The emphasis on intellectual rigor and classical education produced not just competent administrators, but philosophers, poets, artists, engineers, and reformers. The Song dynasty became a civilization of ideas, and it changed the world. Economically, Song China was a powerhouse. Advances in agriculture, including the widespread cultivation of fast-ripening champa rice, allowed for multiple harvests per year. Populations surged, cities grew, trade flourished. The Song introduced paper money, a global first, issued by the government to handle the demands of a growing market economy. Large-scale manufacturing of iron and steel boomed. Technological innovations in hydraulic engineering, textiles, and shipbuilding made Song China one of the most productive economies on Earth. Urban life reached new heights. Cities like Kaifeng and later Hangzhou became bustling metropolises with populations over 1 million, filled with shops, theaters, tea houses, and markets. These were not just administrative capitals, they were centers of consumer culture. The merchant class grew in power and influence, even as Confucian ideals continued to prioritize the scholar over the trader. Culturally, the Song was a golden age. In philosophy, this era gave birth to Neo-Confucianism, a revival and reinterpretation of Confucian thought that blended metaphysics, ethics, and cosmology. Thinkers like Zhu Xi redefined the canon of Confucian learning, creating a structured, rational, and moral universe that would shape education and ideology in East Asia for centuries. In the arts, the Song reached unmatched refinement. landscape. Painting matured into one of China's highest art forms. Artists like Fan Quan, Guo Xi, and Ma Yuan depicted vast mountains, flowing rivers, and misty forests, not just as scenery, but as reflections of cosmic order. Poetry, calligraphy, and ceramics all flourished. Song porcelain, in particular, achieved near-mythic status, prized across Asia and later the world for its elegance and craftsmanship. But the most astounding legacy of the Song dynasty may be its scientific and technological breakthroughs. This was the age of Shen Kuo, a polymath who studied astronomy, geology, engineering, and medicine. In his writings, he theorized about land formation through erosion and sedimentation, anticipating geological concepts by centuries. He described the magnetic compass not just as a curiosity, but as a navigational tool. In another domain, Song created a sophisticated astronomical clock tower, a mechanized wonder powered by water-driven escapement centuries before similar designs appeared in Europe. This was also the period that witnessed the invention of movable type printing. While woodblock printing had existed since the Tang, it was the Song who brought printing technology into widespread use. The result was an explosion of books, religious texts, Confucian classics, medical manuals, legal codes, and literature, reaching audiences across class and region. The dream of a literate, educated society suddenly became real, and then there was gunpowder. Chinese alchemists had been experimenting with saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal for centuries, often in search of immortality. But during the Song, those experiments began to yield practical and explosive results. By the 11th century, the Song military was using gunpowder-based weapons, fire arrows, bombs, flamethrowers, and early grenades. These weren't yet firearms in the modern sense, but they marked the beginning of a technological revolution that would change warfare forever, in China and eventually the world. Yet, even as the Song excelled in science and culture, they struggled militarily. The dynasty was constantly under threat from powerful neighbors. To the north, nomadic groups like the Khitan Liao and later the Jurchen Jin grew in strength. In 1127, the unthinkable happened. The Jurchen invaded from the northeast, captured the capital Kaifeng, and took the emperor hostage. This disaster, known as the Jingkang incident, forced the remnants of the Song court to flee south. What followed was the Southern Song dynasty, 1127–1279, with a new capital in Hangzhou. Though militarily weakened, this era retained much of the North's brilliance. The economy shifted toward maritime trade, the Song navy expanded, shipbuilding advanced. Compass navigation, improved sails, and large ocean-going vessels helped Song merchants dominate East Asian seas. Hangzhou, described by foreign travelers like Marco Polo as the finest city on earth, became a symbol of resilience, a glittering urban hub where art, commerce, and philosophy continued to thrive, even in the face of political fragility. But the shadow on the horizon was growing. In the north, a new power was rising, one unlike any China had faced before. Fierce, fast, and organized, the Mongols under Genghis Khan began their conquests in the early 13th century. They overran the Jin in northern China. By the time of Genghis's grandson, Kublai Khan, they had turned their attention south. The Sijini, Southern Song resisted with all its might. Engineers built river defenses, generals employed gunpowder weapons, but the Mongol war machine was relentless. In 1279, the last Song emperor, a child, drowned himself as his fleet was destroyed. The Song dynasty fell. China was now under foreign rule for the first time since the fall of the Tang, and yet the Song legacy was indelible. Though it never ruled a truly unified empire, the Song redefined Chinese civilization. It created a model of meritocratic government, urban culture, technological ingenuity, and philosophical depth. It proved that a dynasty need not dominate militarily to lead a golden age. The Song's collapse was a tragedy, but its contributions, paper money, printing, the compass, gunpowder, civil exams, would echo across the globe. The age of innovation had ended. The age of empire would return under a foreign conqueror who styled himself not as an outsider, but as the legitimate ruler of all under heaven. The Yuan dynasty was coming. In 1279, China fell to an enemy unlike any it had ever seen. For the first time in its long history, the entire Chinese heartland was ruled by a foreign power, not merely as invaders or warlords, but as emperors. These were the Mongols, steppe warriors who, in just a few decades, had carved out the largest contiguous empire in human history. And now, under the leadership of Kublai Khan, they crowned themselves emperors of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. The Mongol conquest of China had been long, bloody, and methodical, starting with Genghis Khan's early campaigns against the Western Xia and Jin dynasties, and culminating under Kublai's rule with the final defeat of the Southern Song. The Mongols slowly enveloped the fractured Chinese states. Unlike previous dynasties born from rebellion or internal collapse, the Yuan was an external regime, imposed by an empire whose cultural foundations lay far beyond the walls of Chinese civilization. And yet, Kublai Khan was no ordinary conqueror. He didn't simply claim victory over China. He claimed China itself. In 1271, 8 years before the conquest of the last Song stronghold, Kublai declared the formation of the Yuan dynasty and styled himself Emperor of China. This was not a Mongol Khanate ruling over Chinese subjects from afar. This was a dynasty in the Chinese tradition, with a capital in Dadu, modern-day Beijing, Confucian-style bureaucracy, and a throne that claimed to inherit the mandate of heaven. Kublai wore Mongol robes and held Mongol court rituals, but he also employed Chinese scholars, studied Chinese customs, and engaged with Chinese political thought. This balancing act was the essence of the Yuan dynasty, a collision of cultures, a fusion of imperial identities. At its core, it was a Mongol empire, hierarchical, martial, and deeply loyal to its nomadic roots. Yet to govern China, the Mongols had to adapt. The result was a uniquely hybrid state, powerful, prosperous, and yet always precariously balanced. The Yuan dynasty's reach was unprecedented. As part of the greater Mongol Empire, China was now connected as never before to a vast transcontinental network. Trade, diplomacy, and ideas flowed along protected routes from Europe to Persia to Central Asia to the Pacific. The Silk Road, once a fragile lifeline, became a Mongol highway of goods and culture. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, traveled to Yuan China and served at Kublai's court. He returned to Europe with tales of towering cities, paper money, imperial couriers, and unimaginable wealth. Many in Europe didn't believe him, and yet much of it was true. Yuan China was one of the world's most advanced civilizations. Under Kublai, major infrastructure projects resumed. The Grand Canal was repaired and extended. Postal systems, using fast relay stations and horseback couriers, allowed messages to travel with astonishing speed. Paper money became the backbone of the economy. The Yuan minted massive quantities of currency to finance their rule, an innovation, but also a seed of future inflation. The Mongols maintained some Confucian administrative systems, but they were deeply distrustful of the native Chinese elite. In the Yuan hierarchy, society was divided into 4 main classes. At the top were Mongols, followed by Central Asians and Middle Easterners, then Northern Chinese, and at the bottom, Southern Chinese, mostly those who had resisted the Mongol conquest. This rigid ethnic stratification limited Chinese participation in high office and bred widespread resentment. Still, the Yuan tolerated religious diversity. Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Islam, Nestorian Christianity, and even Judaism all coexisted under Mongol rule. Temples, mosques, and monasteries were funded by the state. Philosophical debates were encouraged. Science and medicine from the Islamic world flowed into Chinese centers of learning. The Yuan court became a cosmopolitan crossroads, and Beijing, or Dadu, a hub of the known world. But this pluralism did not guarantee stability. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Mongols were foreign rulers, their authority sustained by military dominance, not cultural legitimacy. Many Chinese scholars saw them not as successors to the mandate of heaven, but as usurpers. The Yuan emperors, after Kublai, were increasingly weak, decadent, and disconnected. Factionalism at court grew, corruption deepened, and then there were natural disasters. Floods, droughts, famines, and plagues, seen by many as cosmic signs that the mandate of heaven had been lost. The Yuan tax system, stretched thin by war and bureaucracy, failed to respond. As grain shipments faltered and prices soared, peasant rebellions erupted. The most famous of these was the Red Turban Rebellion, a broad-based uprising driven by poverty, religious prophecy, and Han Chinese nationalism. From these flames emerged a charismatic former monk and rebel general named Zhu Yuanzhang. Leading peasant armies, he seized city after city, rallying Han Chinese to his cause. In 1368, he entered Beijing. The Yuan court fled north. Zhu declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Ming. The Yuan dynasty had ruled China for less than a century, from 1271 to 1368, and yet its impact was enormous. For one, it marked the first time China was fully conquered and ruled by an external people. The Mongols proved that Chinese civilization could be governed, even reshaped, by outsiders. They expanded China's political map, reinforced cross-continental connections, and introduced a new scale of imperial ambition. Their model of absolute power, centralized, mobile, and trans-ethnic, would influence not just Chinese history, but global empire building for centuries. But the Yuan also left deep wounds. The ethnic hierarchy they imposed, with Chinese at the bottom, seeded long-term resentment. Their heavy taxation and lack of bureaucratic reform alienated the population. Their embrace of paper money, while visionary, spiraled into hyperinflation and economic crisis. And though they claimed the mandate of heaven, few Chinese ever believed they truly held it. Still, the Yuan period shattered illusions. It proved that China was not invulnerable, that its borders could be breached, that its throne could be claimed by a foreign horseman with no roots in Confucian thought. The trauma of that loss and the determination to restore native rule would define the next dynasty, because what came next was a return to Han Chinese power. A dynasty born in rebellion and dedicated to restoration. A dynasty that would fortify the Great Wall, send fleets across the Indian Ocean, and try, for a time, to revive China's ancient greatness. The Ming dynasty was coming. When the Yuan dynasty collapsed in 1368, it was more than a political transition. It was a reclamation. For nearly a century, China had lived under foreign rule. The Mongols, with their military might and foreign customs, had controlled the imperial throne, imposed ethnic hierarchies, and transformed the bureaucratic machinery of empire. Now, for the first time since the Tang, the Chinese themselves, the Han majority, had taken back the mandate of heaven. At their head was a man who had risen from starvation and illiteracy to become emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, founder of the Ming dynasty. Zhu's story was improbable. Orphaned during a famine, he became a beggar, then a Buddhist monk. But the collapse of Yuan authority gave him opportunity. He joined the Red Turban Rebellion, quickly rose through the ranks, and eventually emerged as the dominant leader of the anti-Yuan forces. In 1368, he entered Beijing, declared the birth of the Ming, brilliant, dynasty, and took the throne as Emperor Hongwu. His reign would redefine what it meant to rule China, where the Mongols had ruled from horseback. Hongwu ruled from the center, obsessed with control, stability, and the reassertion of Han Chinese ideals. The early Ming state was shaped by fear of chaos. Hongwu abolished the office of the prime minister, consolidating power directly in his hands. He personally reviewed thousands of documents, signed off on appointments, and micromanaged the administration. Paranoia defined his rule. Suspected traitors were executed by the thousands. Yet behind this authoritarian grip was a genuine desire to restore order and justice. The Ming dynasty was built on reconstruction. Hongwu's government focused on land reform, agricultural recovery, and the revival of Confucian moral order. Land was redistributed to poor farmers. Taxes were standardized. Peasant households were registered and organized into local groups for taxation and mutual responsibility. The dynasty re-established the civil service examination system, signaling that once again, merit and education, not bloodline, would be the path to power. Confucianism returned to the heart of the state. Temples were rebuilt, rituals reinstated. Chinese classical texts were recompiled and disseminated. Under Hongwu's successors, especially his grandson, the Yongle Emperor, the Ming entered a period of ambition and magnificence. Yongle, a forceful and strategic ruler, moved the capital to Beijing and began the construction of the Forbidden City, an architectural statement of imperial authority and cosmic centrality. Its vast courtyards, palaces, and ceremonial halls symbolized the rebirth of Chinese civilization under native rule. Yongle also ordered the compilation of the Yongle Encyclopedia, the largest collection of knowledge in the world at that time, covering astronomy, medicine, philosophy, history, and geography in thousands of handwritten volumes. It was a declaration that Chinese scholarship and civilization had survived foreign occupation and remained the most advanced on Earth. But the most dramatic gesture of the early Ming wasn't on land, it was across the sea. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming court launched a series of maritime expeditions under the command of Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch admiral of Hui Chinese origin. His treasure fleets were astonishing, towering ships, some said to be over 120 meters long, carrying thousands of sailors, soldiers, and diplomats. Zheng He's 7 voyages reached as far as India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa. He brought back giraffes, zebras, foreign envoys, and tributes to the emperor. These were not voyages of conquest, but of demonstration, showcasing Ming China's might, wealth, and cosmopolitan command. The Ming had the capacity to project power across oceans. And yet, after Yongle's death, the voyages stopped. Court factions deemed them too expensive, too foreign, too risky. Ships were left to rot. China turned inward again. This shift from outward expansion to inward consolidation defined the middle and late Ming period. The empire focused on internal stability, border defense, and the Great Wall, which was reinforced and expanded into the iconic structure known today. Unlike earlier versions, which were often earth or rammed stone, the Ming Wall was built with brick, mortar, and watchtowers, a permanent symbol of defense and deterrence. Economically, the Ming thrived. Trade flourished both domestically and internationally, especially through the maritime silk routes. Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea were in global demand. The empire was integrated into an early form of global trade, especially through its relationship with Spanish silver from the Americas, which flowed into China via the Philippines. Silver became the backbone of the Ming monetary system, transforming markets and creating both prosperity and instability. Culturally, the Ming was vibrant. Printing exploded. Commercial publishers printed novels, medical guides, religious texts, and encyclopedias for a growing literate public. The literary novel blossomed. Works like Journey to the West, Water Margin, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms emerged, some of the most enduring fiction in world literature. In painting, calligraphy, and ceramics, the Ming style was both refined and bold. Blue and white porcelain, in particular, became synonymous with Chinese craftsmanship, and yet, beneath the surface, tensions grew. The very strength of the early Ming, its centralized authority, began to suffocate the system. Corruption infiltrated the bureaucracy. Eunuchs, once marginal figures, gained massive influence over imperial decisions, especially during weak reigns. Tax burdens grew, and local officials became increasingly extractive. Natural disasters, including floods and droughts, were met with bureaucratic delay and inaction. In the 16th and 17th centuries, population growth outpaced agricultural expansion. Regional famines and plague outbreaks destabilized communities. The silver-based economy, once a strength, became a liability when global supply chains faltered. When Spain's silver output declined, China's tax system, based on fixed silver payments, imploded. By the early 1600s, the Ming dynasty was hemorrhaging. Revolts erupted across the countryside. One of the most dangerous was led by Li Zicheng, a former postal worker turned rebel commander. In 1644, his forces breached Beijing. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, hanged himself from a tree near the Forbidden City, but the fall of the Ming did not lead to native restoration. As rebel armies looted the capital, a new foreign power entered from the north, the Manchus, descendants of the Jurchens, who had once ruled as the Jin dynasty centuries earlier. From their base in Manchuria, they marched into Beijing, declared the start of a new era, and founded the Qing dynasty. The Ming had fallen, but like the Han and the Tang before it, its legacy would outlast its rule. The Ming dynasty represented a return to Chinese governance by Chinese rulers after centuries of fragmentation and foreign domination. It restored cultural pride, rebuilt state institutions, expanded infrastructure, and reasserted China's position as a global center of civilization. Though it collapsed under its own weight, it gave China the confidence that it could rise again, even after being conquered. And now China would face a new chapter. The Manchus were foreign, but unlike the Mongols, they were ready to adapt, absorb, and rule for the long haul. The Qing dynasty was coming, and with it, both prosperity and trauma on a global scale. The Qing dynasty, 1644–1912, was the last imperial dynasty in Chinese history, and one of the most complex. It began with conquest, reached unprecedented heights of power and territorial expansion, and ended in humiliation, revolution, and collapse. The Qing were not Han Chinese, but Manchu, a semi-nomadic people from the northeast who had once been vassals to the Ming and later rivals. Their rise to power marked the second time in history that China would be ruled by a foreign ethnicity. But unlike the Mongols, the Manchus would rule for nearly 270 years, blending conquest with adaptation. The Manchus took Beijing in 1644, under dramatic circumstances. The Ming capital had just fallen to the rebel general Li Zicheng, whose forces killed and looted as they claimed the throne. The Ming general Wu Sangui, cornered and desperate, opened the gates of the Great Wall to the Manchu army to repel the rebels. Once inside, the Manchus took power for themselves. Li Zicheng was defeated. Wu Sangui was sidelined, and a new dynasty was born, the Great Qing. To legitimize their rule, the early Qing emperors made a calculated move. They adopted many of the Ming's institutions. They preserved the Confucian bureaucracy, kept the imperial examination system, and patronized Chinese scholars and traditions. At the same time, they enforced Manchu customs at court. The Q hairstyle was mandated, and dual language administration became the norm. The Qing positioned themselves as guardians of tradition, not destroyers of it. Under this hybrid model, the Qing state flourished. During the reigns of Emperor Kangxi, r. 1661–1722, and Emperor Qianlong, r. 1735–1796, China entered one of its most prosperous and stable eras. These emperors were not just administrators, they were scholars, poets, patrons of the arts, and military strategists. Kangxi launched major educational reforms, quelled revolts, and compiled dictionaries and encyclopedias. Qianlong expanded the empire's territory to its greatest historical extent, incorporating Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and parts of Central Asia. Under the Kangxi-Qianlong Golden Age, the Qing dynasty governed over more than 300 million people, making it the most populous empire on earth. Trade boomed, agriculture flourished. The arts, painting, calligraphy, opera, and porcelain reached refined new heights. The Qing court became a center of cultural sophistication, and Chinese goods flooded world markets. Porcelain, silk, lacquerware, and tea were exported to Europe in vast quantities. Westerners began to see China not as an exotic curiosity, but as a symbol of advanced civilization. And yet cracks were forming. By the late 18th century, the Qing bureaucracy had grown bloated and complacent. Corruption spread through the lower levels of administration. Local officials taxed excessively, abused power, and failed to respond to the needs of a growing population. Natural disasters worsened social unrest. The empire's population exploded, but agricultural yields could not keep pace. Peasant revolts became more frequent. At the same time, foreign pressure began to mount. The Qing had long considered themselves the Middle Kingdom, superior to the rest of the world. But by the 19th century, European powers, industrialized, armed with new weapons, and driven by global trade, were knocking on China's doors. The Opium Wars shattered the illusion of Qing supremacy. In the early 1800s, the British East India Company began smuggling opium into China to pay for tea and other goods. When the Qing attempted to crack down on the trade, most famously through Commissioner Lin Zexu's destruction of opium in Canton, Britain retaliated. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, ended in disaster for China. The Treaty of Nanjing forced the Qing to cede Hong Kong, open ports to foreign merchants, and grant extraterritorial rights to foreigners. It was the first of many unequal treaties. This marked the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. The Second Opium War, 1856–1860, fought by Britain and France, deepened the humiliation. The imperial summer palace, the Yuanming Yuan, was looted and burned by foreign troops. Foreign powers gained more concessions. Christian missionaries entered in droves. Chinese sovereignty was being hollowed out from the outside and eroded from within. As foreign influence grew, the Qing faced one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history, the Taiping Rebellion, 1850–1864. Led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed examination candidate who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the rebellion combined Christian millenarianism with anti-Manchu nationalism. At its peak, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom controlled vast territories and millions of people. The Qing response was sluggish, fragmented, and ineffective. Only regional armies, led by Confucian generals like Zheng Guofan, crushed the rebellion at the cost of over 20 million lives. The empire never fully recovered. Attempts to reform, like the self-strengthening movement, introduced Western military and industrial techniques, but the Qing never truly modernized their political structure. A conservative court resisted deep institutional change. The Dowager Empress Cixi, who ruled as regent for decades, supported limited reform while undermining more ambitious transformations. At the turn of the 20th century, a last gasp for reform emerged in the form of the 100 Days Reform, 1898, a radical attempt to reshape the Qing state into a constitutional monarchy. But it was swiftly crushed by conservative forces, backed by Cixi. Frustration boiled over. In 1900, anti-foreign sentiment exploded in the Boxer Rebellion, led by martial artists who believed they could resist bullets with spiritual power. Their rebellion was a disaster. A coalition of 8 foreign powers invaded Beijing, looted the capital again, and imposed crushing reparations. Qing prestige was obliterated. The dynasty limped on for another decade, but the age of empires was ending. Revolutionary groups, led by intellectuals, merchants, and students, called for the abolition of the monarchy. The most famous of these was Sun Yat-sen, a Western-educated doctor who envisioned a modern republican China. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution broke out. The Qing army defected. Provinces declared independence, and in early 1912, the last emperor of China, the child Puyi, just 6 years old, abdicated the throne. More than 2,000 years of imperial history had come to an end. The Qing dynasty in many ways encapsulated the entire arc of Chinese empire. It began with conquest and assimilation, matured into power and prosperity, resisted change in its prime, and collapsed under the weight of internal rot and external pressure. Its rulers had expanded China's borders, refined its court rituals, and nurtured its culture. But they had also resisted reform, misread the West, and clung too long to a fading world order. Its end was not simply the end of a dynasty. It was the end of imperial China itself, the end of Confucian monarchy, of the mandate of heaven, of the bureaucratic empire that had endured in some form since the time of the Zhou. What would follow was chaos. Warlords, invasion, civil war, revolution, and eventually a new kind of state, the Republic, and later the People's Republic. But through all of it, the memory of the dynasties endured. The philosophies, the infrastructure, the culture, the inventions, the language, the continuity, this, the 5,000-year arc, is what made China not just another civilization, but the longest continuous one on Earth. Empires fall, but civilizations, if they adapt, survive. China's story is not the story of a single dynasty, emperor, or war. It is the story of a civilization that refused to break, no matter how many times it was torn apart. For over 5,000 years, it has endured. Through flood and famine, rebellion and invasion, conquest and collapse. It has been ruled by emperors born in peasant huts and emperors who sat on thrones before they could walk. It has been governed by native sons and foreign khans. It has burned its own cities, buried its own scholars, and risen from its own ashes, again and again and again. In that time, it gave the world the compass, paper, printing, and gunpowder. It connected continents before modern maps existed. It built walls that outlasted dynasties, wrote poetry that still echoes in classrooms, and developed systems of thought that shaped how humans understand morality, hierarchy, and the state. Other ancient civilizations turned to dust. Mesopotamia vanished, the pharaohs of Egypt entombed. The empires of Rome, Byzantium, the Aztecs, relics of the past. But China remained. Not unchanged. No civilization can survive by staying the same. But through constant reinvention, through the blending of ideas, the absorption of conquerors, the repetition of cycles, rise, fall, restore, China became something rare, a civilization unbroken across millennia. From the oracle bones of the Shang to the bureaucracies of the Han, the cosmopolitan brilliance of the Tang, to the technological genius of the Song, the grandeur of the Ming to the tragic complexity of the Qing, every dynasty layered onto the next. Names changed, capitals moved, but the rhythm continued. The language evolved, but never disappeared. The philosophies argued, but never died. The identity fractured, but always returned. Even when the emperors finally fell in 1912, the civilizational core remained. The republic rose. Then revolution, war, occupation, famine, isolation, and global resurgence. And yet, the language is spoken. The classics studied, the inventions remembered, the ancestors honored. 5,000 years is not just a number. It's a memory passed down in poems, family names, food, ritual, and soil. To understand China is not to memorize emperors or battles. It is to see a people who have survived time itself, not as a museum, but as a force. This is not a closed, a chapter. The civilization continues. It adapts, it rebuilds, it remembers. And somewhere in the echoes of the past, in the tombs of Qin Shi Huang, in the verses of Du Fu, in the sails of Zheng He's lost fleets, is the proof that while nations rise and fall, civilizations endure, China's is the longest to endure.